The laughter started before I even reached the firing line. I could hear it echoing across the concrete walls of the Precision Marksmanship Academy, bouncing off the steel targets like ricochets. 23 male cadets, all convinced they belonged here more than I did, all watching as I struggled to group my shots within the black circle at 50 meters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Maybe try holding it the right way around, called out Marcus Chen, the Academy's golden boy who'd scored a perfect qualification on his first try. The others erupted in snickers, their voices creating a chorus of dismissal that had become the soundtrack to my days here. I kept my breathing steady, ignored the heat rising in my cheeks, and squeezed the trigger again. The shot went wide, punching a hole in the white space 2 inches left of center. More laughter. Someone made a comment about wasting ammunition. Another voice suggested I might be more comfortable in the kitchen than on the range. The truth was, I'd been coming to this academy for 6 weeks, and my performance had been consistently mediocre. Not terrible enough to get kicked out, but nowhere near good enough to earn respect. The instructors tolerated me because my father had pulled strings to get me enrolled. Senator William Hayes carried enough political weight to open doors, but he couldn't make me shoot straight, and everyone here knew it. "Hayes, you're holding up the line," barked Instructor Davidson, his voice carrying that special blend of authority and barely concealed irritation he reserved just for me. "Either hit something or step aside." I lowered my rifle and stepped back from the firing position. The cadet behind me, a stocky kid from Texas named Riley Cooper, stepped up with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. He dropped into a perfect prone position, acquired his target, and put 3 rounds through the X-ring without breaking a sweat. The range fell silent except for the soft ping of brass hitting concrete. "That's how it's done," Davidson announced, his approval clear in every syllable. "Cooper, excellent fundamentals. Clean, controlled, consistent." I wanted to disappear. 6 weeks of this, and I still felt like an imposter wearing someone else's uniform. The digital camouflage fatigues hung loose on my frame, issued in the smallest size they had but still too big. My helmet wobbled when I moved too quickly, and my shooting glasses kept sliding down my nose despite the adjustable strap. The other cadets filed past me as we rotated to the next station, and I caught fragments of their conversations. Talk about weekend plans, discussions of advanced techniques they'd learned from YouTube videos, speculation about who would make it to the final selection course. Nobody included me in these conversations. I existed on the periphery, the senator's daughter who'd bought her way into a place she didn't deserve. "Don't take it personally," said a voice beside me. I turned to see Elena Rodriguez, one of only 3 other women in the program, adjusting her rifle sling. She was everything I wasn't: confident, competent, naturally gifted with firearms. Her shots consistently landed in the 9 and 10 ring, and even the male cadets respected her abilities. They give everyone a hard time at first. I wanted to believe her, but we both knew that wasn't true. They gave me a hard time because I was failing, because I was the weakest link in a program designed to identify and train the military's next generation of precision marksmen. Elena had earned her place here through skill and determination. I was here because my father had made a phone call. The afternoon session moved to long-range fundamentals, and my stomach tightened with familiar dread. While the others discussed wind reading and ballistic calculations with the casual expertise of people who'd grown up hunting, I struggled to understand basic concepts like minute of angle and mil-dot reticles. The mathematics that came naturally to them felt like a foreign language to me. "All right, listen up," Davidson called out as we gathered around the 300-meter range. "Today we're working on environmental factors. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure. These variables become critical as your engagement distances increase." He pointed toward the far end of the range, where steel silhouettes stood like silent sentinels against the backdrop of rolling hills. At 300 meters, a small error in calculation or technique becomes magnified. Miss your wind call by just 1 mile per hour, and you could be looking at a complete miss. The demonstration began with Elena, naturally. She studied her data book, checked her wind flags, made precise adjustments to her scope turrets, and sent a round downrange that struck the center of the target with a satisfying clang. The class murmured their approval. Marcus went next, consulting his ballistic calculator and making a show of his methodical approach. His shot hit slightly left of center, still well within the scoring area, more nods of approval from the instructors. When my turn came, I felt the familiar weight of expectation and impending failure. I'd studied the theory, memorized the formulas, practiced the procedures, but something always went wrong when it mattered. I settled into position behind my rifle, trying to remember everything I'd been taught about natural point of aim and proper sight picture. The wind flags indicated a gentle breeze from left to right, maybe 3 miles per hour. I dialed in what I thought was the correct adjustment and pressed my cheek against the stock. Through the scope, the target wavered slightly in the heat mirage rising from the concrete. I controlled my breathing, found my natural respiratory pause, and squeezed the trigger with what I hoped was perfect follow-through. The shot impacted high and right, missing the silhouette entirely and striking the dirt berm behind it. Silence fell over the group like a blanket. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. "Jesus Christ, Hayes," Davidson muttered, his patience finally exhausted. "That wasn't even close. What the hell are you doing up there?" My face burned with embarrassment. "I thought I calculated the wind correctly, sir. Maybe I made an error in—" "Maybe you made an error?" His voice rose enough that cadets from other firing lines turned to look. "You missed a man-sized target at 300 meters. That's not a calculation error, that's a fundamental failure to understand the basics of marksmanship." The humiliation was complete. 23 pairs of eyes stared at me, some with pity, others with barely concealed amusement. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I'd been trying, that I'd spent hours in the study hall poring over ballistics charts and wind-reading techniques. But the evidence was there in the dirt, a wasted round and a complete miss. "Maybe this program isn't for everyone," Davidson continued, his voice carrying across the range with the authority of someone who'd made difficult decisions before. "Some people have the aptitude for precision work, and others." He let the sentence hang in the air like smoke from a gunshot. I bit my tongue and nodded, accepting the rebuke because arguing would only make things worse. The unspoken message was clear. I didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of technical instruction that I struggled to follow. Discussion of wind deflection values and trajectory calculations that might as well have been quantum physics for all the sense they made to me. The other cadets asked intelligent questions about advanced techniques while I sat in the back, trying to make myself invisible. During the evening study period, I found myself alone in the dormitory common area, while the others gathered in small groups to discuss the day's lessons. Through the window, I could see some of them on the practice range, getting in extra trigger time with their personal rifles. Elena was there with Marcus and a few others, their shots ringing out in the cool evening air with mechanical precision. I pulled out my notebook and tried to make sense of my shooting data from the past 6 weeks. Page after page of missed shots, wild groups, and fundamental errors that should have been corrected weeks ago. The pattern was unmistakable. I was getting worse, not better. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "How are things going at the academy? Your instructors sending good reports?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, "Everything's fine. Learning a lot." The lie came easily, but it sat heavy in my stomach. He'd invested political capital to get me into this program, calling in favors and making promises to people who mattered. The last thing he needed was his daughter washing out in spectacular fashion, becoming another example of nepotism gone wrong. A knock on the door interrupted my brooding. Elena stood in the doorway, still wearing her shooting jacket, her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she favored on the range. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, already moving toward the couch across from me. I shrugged, closing my notebook before she could see the depressing statistics inside. "Free country." "Rough day out there," she said, settling into the cushions with the easy comfort of someone who belonged wherever she went. "Davidson was harder on you than usual." "He was being honest," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I missed a target at 300 meters. That's pretty inexcusable for someone who's supposed to be training as a precision marksman." Elena studied my face for a moment, her dark eyes searching for something I couldn't identify. "You know, when I first started shooting competitively, I couldn't hit the broadside of a barn. My dad used to say I was wasting ammunition and embarrassing the family name. I looked up from my notebook, surprised by the admission. Elena had always seemed naturally gifted, the kind of person who picked up complex skills without apparent effort. Really? Really. It took me 3 years of constant practice before I won my first match. 3 years of missing targets, getting beat by kids half my age, going home crying because I couldn't understand why something that looked so simple was so damn hard. She leaned forward, her expression serious. The difference between good shooters and great shooters isn't natural talent, it's persistence. The willingness to fail 1,000 times while you figure out what works. I wanted to believe her, but the evidence suggested otherwise. I've been failing for 6 weeks straight. How much persistence is too much? That depends, she said, standing up and moving toward the door. How badly do you want this? The question hung in the air long after she'd left. How badly did I want this? I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks, and I still didn't have a good answer. I'd come to the academy because my father thought it would be good for my character, because he believed military service would teach me discipline and purpose. But what did I want? I walked to the window and looked out at the practice range. A lone figure was still out there, silhouetted against the setting sun, methodically working through a series of shots. The rhythm was hypnotic, the crack of the rifle, a brief pause, then another shot. Over and over, with mechanical precision. Something about the shooter's form nagged at me. The position was perfect, the follow-through textbook, but there was something else. An economy of movement that spoke of years of practice, a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. Even from this distance, I could tell this wasn't just another cadet getting in extra trigger time. The figure finally stood, collected spent brass from the ground, and began walking back toward the dormitory. As they came closer, I recognized the tall, lean frame of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the Academy's chief instructor for advanced marksmanship. She rarely appeared on the basic ranges, preferring to work with the advanced students who were already showing promise. Dr. Mitchell had arrived at the Academy 3 months before I did, brought in from some classified military program to develop new training protocols. The other instructors treated her with a deference that bordered on reverence, and the advanced students spoke her name in hushed tones. She'd never spoken directly to me, never even acknowledged my existence during the few lectures she'd given to our class, but as she passed beneath the window, she looked up and our eyes met for just a moment. There was something in her gaze that I couldn't interpret. Not pity, not judgment, but a kind of measuring look, as if she was evaluating something about me that I didn't even know existed. Then she was gone, disappearing into the building, with the same quiet efficiency that seemed to characterize everything she did. I returned to my notebook, but the numbers on the page had lost their sting. Elena's words echoed in my mind. How badly do you want this? Maybe the question wasn't whether I had the talent to succeed here. Maybe the question was whether I had the courage to keep failing until I figured out how to succeed. The next morning brought another day of humiliation disguised as training. We moved through the standard progression: marksmanship fundamentals, breathing techniques, trigger control, sight alignment. All the basics I should have mastered weeks ago, but somehow kept screwing up when it mattered. Marcus Chen was holding court near the ammunition table, regaling a group of cadets with stories of his civilian shooting competitions. The thing about long-range work, he was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd read every article in Precision Shooting magazine, is that it separates the real marksman from the wannabes. You can fake your way through basic rifle training, but when you start stretching out to real distances, the fundamentals either work, or they don't. Several heads nodded in agreement. These were the Academy's rising stars, the cadets who'd caught the attention of the advanced instructors, the ones who would probably be selected for specialized training programs when this course concluded. I heard they're bringing in some hotshot from Special Operations Command next week, added Cooper, the kid from Texas whose confidence never seemed to waver. Supposed to demonstrate some advanced techniques for the top performers. Think any of us will make the cut? Asked another cadet. Marcus glanced in my direction, his expression making his opinion clear. I think they're looking for people who can actually hit what they're aiming at. The comment drew chuckles from his audience, but I pretended not to hear. I had learned that engaging with their mockery only made things worse. Better to focus on my own performance and hope for gradual improvement. but improvement remained elusive. During the morning session, I managed to put 4 out of 5 shots into the black at 100 meters, which should have been encouraging progress. Instead, Davidson pointed out that my group was still twice the size of what would be considered acceptable, and my point of impact was consistently low and left, indicating fundamental problems with my shooting position. "Hayes, you're jerking the trigger," he said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd explained this concept too many times already. "You're anticipating the recoil and pulling the shot off target. We covered this 3 weeks ago." He was right, of course. I could feel myself flinching every time I pressed the trigger, could sense my body tensing up in anticipation of the rifle's report. But knowing what I was doing wrong and being able to fix it were apparently two different things. The afternoon brought long-range theory, 2 hours of classroom instruction that should have been fascinating, but instead felt like a foreign language class where I'd missed the first semester. Dr. Mitchell herself was teaching, her PowerPoint slides filled with ballistic charts and atmospheric data that the other cadets seemed to absorb effortlessly. "External ballistics become increasingly important as engagement distances increase," she was saying, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd learned these lessons through practical application rather than textbooks. "A bullet's trajectory is affected by gravity, air resistance, wind deflection, and atmospheric conditions. Understanding these factors is essential for consistent accuracy at extended ranges." She clicked to the next slide, showing a trajectory chart that looked like hieroglyphics to me. "Who can tell me how atmospheric pressure affects bullet flight?" Elena's hand shot up immediately. "Lower pressure reduces air density, which decreases drag and allows the bullet to maintain velocity longer. So shots will impact higher than normal in low-pressure conditions." "Excellent," Dr. Mitchell replied, making a note on her tablet. "And temperature?" Marcus jumped in without raising his hand. "Cold air is denser than warm air, so bullets will impact low in cold weather and high in hot weather, assuming you've zeroed at standard temperature and pressure." More approving nods from the instructor. The discussion continued with questions about wind effects, humidity, and altitude, all answered with confidence by students who seemed to understand these concepts intuitively. I sat in the back row, frantically taking notes and trying to keep up with terminology that might as well have been Sanskrit. When the lecture ended, the other cadets filed out, discussing the finer points of ballistic coefficients and sectional density. I gathered my material slowly, hoping to avoid the usual post-class conversations where my ignorance would be on full display. "Miss Hayes," Dr. Mitchell's voice stopped me at the door. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" My stomach dropped. This was it. The conversation where she'd politely suggest that maybe this program wasn't the right fit for my skill set. I'd been dreading this moment for weeks, but part of me was almost relieved that it was finally happening. I turned back toward her desk, my notebook clutched against my chest like a shield. "Yes, ma'am." She was gathering her papers with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, her movements economical and purposeful. When she looked up, her gray eyes held that same measuring quality I'd noticed the night before. "How are you finding the program so far?" she asked, her tone neutral and professional. The question was clearly a formality, a gentle lead-in to the real conversation about my obvious shortcomings. "It's challenging," I said carefully. "I'm learning a lot." "Are you?" There was something in her voice that made me look up sharply. Not skepticism exactly, but a kind of focused attention that suggested she was listening for something specific in my answer. "I mean, I know my performance hasn't been what anyone expected," I continued, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm working on the fundamentals, but I seem to be missing something basic that everyone else understands." "Doctor?" Mitchell closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Tell me about your shooting background before you came here." "I don't really have one," I admitted. I'd fired a rifle maybe 3 times in my life before arriving at the academy. My father thought this program would be good for building character and discipline. "And what do you think?" The question caught me off guard. "About what?" "About whether this program is good for building character and discipline. About whether you want to be here." I opened my mouth to give the expected answer, something about being honored to serve and committed to excellence, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself being honest in a way that surprised me. "I don't know," I said quietly. "I came here because my father wanted me to. I've been failing consistently since day one, Everyone here is better than me, and most of them think I don't belong. Maybe they're right. Dr. Mitchell nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something she'd been thinking. The other cadets discuss ballistics and wind reading like they're reciting multiplication tables. Does that intimidate you? Terrify might be a better word, I said, attempting a weak smile. Good, she said, and there was something in her voice that made me look up in surprise. Fear means you understand the complexity of what you're trying to learn. Overconfidence is usually a sign that someone doesn't really grasp what they don't know. She stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the range where cadets were setting up for evening practice. Most of the students in this program arrive with years of shooting experience. They've been hunting since childhood, competing in high school shooting sports, absorbing terminology and techniques through osmosis. They have a head start that can look like natural talent. I wasn't sure where she was going with this, but something in her tone suggested this wasn't the dismissal I'd been expecting. But natural talent and technical knowledge are just the beginning, she continued, turning back to face me. The most important qualities for a precision marksman are patience, persistence, and the ability to perform under pressure. Those things can't be taught in a classroom or absorbed through childhood experience. She picked up a small device from her desk, something that looked like a handheld weather station. Do you know what this is? I shook my head. Kestrel weather meter. Measures wind speed, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, density, altitude. Every piece of environmental data a sniper needs to make accurate shots at long range. She set it back down on the desk. The advanced students love gadgets like this. They collect data, run calculations, input variables into ballistic computers, all very precise, very scientific. Isn't that the right approach? It's one approach, she said carefully. But what happens when your equipment fails? When you don't have time to run calculations? When conditions change faster than you can measure them? I didn't have an answer for that. The best marksmen I've worked with learned to read environmental conditions through observation and experience. They developed an intuitive understanding of how bullets behave in different conditions. That kind of knowledge takes years to develop, and it can't be downloaded from a ballistic computer. She moved back to her desk and opened a drawer, pulling out what looked like a small, leather-bound notebook. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and the pages were yellowed with age. This belonged to a sniper I worked with several years ago. Someone who could make shots that defied conventional understanding of ballistics and environmental factors. She handed me the notebook. Take a look. I opened it carefully, expecting to find detailed calculations and technical diagrams. Instead, the pages were filled with sketches and observations written in a cramped, hurried handwriting. Wind patterns drawn as flowing lines across topographical features. Notes about how vegetation moved in different types of air currents. Observations about how heat mirage behaved at different times of day. No ballistic tables, I said, surprised. No computers, no rangefinders, no fancy weather meters. Just observation, experience, and an understanding of how the natural world affects bullet flight. She took the notebook back and returned it to the drawer. That person could make shots at distances that would challenge snipers with far more advanced equipment. The conversation was heading somewhere, but I couldn't figure out where. Are you saying technology is a crutch? I'm saying there are different ways to approach precision marksmanship. The methods taught in this academy work well for most people. They're systematic, repeatable, based on proven scientific principles. But they're not the only way. She gathered the rest of her materials and prepared to leave. Your shooting scores suggest you're struggling with conventional techniques, but struggling with conventional techniques doesn't necessarily mean you lack the potential to be an effective marksman. I stood up as she moved toward the door, my mind racing to process what she'd just told me. Dr. Mitchell, what are you suggesting? She paused at the threshold and looked back at me. I'm suggesting that maybe you've been trying to learn someone else's system instead of developing your own. She checked her watch. Tomorrow afternoon, after regular classes end, meet me at Range 7. We're going to try a different approach. Then she was gone, leaving me standing alone in the empty classroom with more questions than answers. I'd expected to be counseled out of the program, told politely that I lacked the necessary aptitude for precision marksmanship. Instead, I'd been offered something that sounded almost like hope. That evening, I skipped the usual study session and walked out to the range complex. Range 7 was at the far end of the facility, separated from the main training areas by a ridge of low hills. I'd never been there before, but I'd heard the advanced students mention it in hushed tones. It was where the really serious long-range work happened, where distances stretched out to 1,000 meters and beyond. The range was empty now, the steel targets barely visible in the gathering dusk. I stood at the firing line and tried to imagine what it would feel like to engage targets at those distances. The basic marksmanship I'd been struggling with was conducted at ranges where you could clearly see your target through iron sights. Out here, targets would be visible only through high-powered optics, and environmental factors would have dramatic effects on bullet flight. A sound behind me made me turn. Dr. Mitchell was walking up the path from the parking area, carrying what looked like a rifle case and a small backpack. She moved with the same quiet efficiency I'd noticed before, covering ground quickly without appearing to hurry. "You're early," she said, setting down her equipment near the concrete firing bench. "I was curious about the range," I replied. "I've never been out here before." She nodded and began unpacking her gear. The rifle case contained a precision bolt-action rifle that looked significantly different from the standard-issue weapons we'd been training with. The scope was larger, the stock more elaborate, the entire system clearly designed for serious long-range work. "This is what most people think of when they hear the term sniper rifle," she said, running her hand along the stock. "Custom barrel, precision trigger, high-end optics. Capable of sub-minute of angle accuracy in the right hands." She pulled a second case from her backpack, smaller and more worn than the first. "And this," she said, opening it to reveal what looked like a much older rifle, "is what actually gets the job done most of the time." The second rifle was clearly military surplus, probably dating back several decades. The stock was scratched and worn, the metal showed signs of hard use, and the scope looked like it had been mounted with equipment from a hardware store. Everything about it suggested a tool that had been used extensively in challenging conditions. "Which one would you choose?" she asked. I studied both weapons, trying to figure out what kind of test this was. The answer seemed obvious. The precision rifle. Better accuracy, more sophisticated optics, designed specifically for long-range work. "Most people would make the same choice," she said, closing the case containing the expensive rifle. "And most people would be wrong." She picked up the older weapon and handed it to me. It was heavier than I'd expected, with a weight distribution that felt different from the rifles I'd been training with. The scope was simple, with thick crosshairs and basic adjustment knobs that looked like they'd been manufactured in another era. This rifle has been used to make shots that would be considered impossible with modern equipment. Targets at extreme range, in adverse conditions, with minimal support equipment. She gestured toward the distant targets barely visible in the fading light. The person who carried this rifle could hit a human-sized target at 1,500 meters using only environmental observation and intuitive understanding of ballistics. I hefted the rifle, trying to imagine making such shots with what amounted to basic equipment. How was that possible? "Because precision isn't about equipment," she said quietly. "It's about understanding. Understanding how your rifle behaves, how environmental conditions affect bullet flight, how to read wind and atmosphere and terrain in ways that can't be reduced to mathematical formulas." She pointed toward the hills beyond the range. "Tomorrow we're going to start developing that understanding, not through calculations or technical instruction, but through observation and experience. You're going to learn to see things that other shooters miss." The sun had set completely now, and the range was bathed in the blue light of dusk. I could barely make out the targets at the far end, just vague shapes against the darker backdrop of the hills. "Dr. Mitchell," I said, "why are you doing this? I mean, why me? There are other students who show much more promise." She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested personal experience rather than academic knowledge. "Because I recognize something in you that reminds me of someone I used to know. Someone who struggled with conventional training methods but had the potential to become something extraordinary." She turned to look at me directly. Someone who needed a different kind of teacher to unlock abilities they didn't even know they possessed. The implications of her words hung in the air like smoke from gunfire. There was clearly more to Dr. Mitchell's story than appeared in her official academy biography, more depth to her knowledge than could be explained by traditional military instruction. "Who was that someone?" I asked. She picked up the rifle case and shouldered her backpack, preparing to leave. "Someone who learned that the most important shots are the ones you take when everything conventional wisdom tells you should be impossible." She started walking back toward the parking area, then paused and looked back. "Tomorrow, 3 o'clock. Range 7. Bring an open mind, and forget everything you think you know about marksmanship." As I walked back to the dormitory, my mind was spinning with questions and possibilities. For the first time since arriving at the academy, I felt something other than dread about my shooting performance. It wasn't confidence exactly, but it was hope. The hope that maybe there was a path forward that didn't require me to be someone I wasn't. The next day's regular classes felt different somehow. I still struggled with the technical aspects of ballistics and wind reading, still missed shots that the other cadets made routinely, but the failure didn't carry the same sting. Instead of seeing each miss as evidence of my inadequacy, I found myself analyzing what had gone wrong and wondering how the unconventional approach Dr. Mitchell had hinted at might address these problems. During lunch, Elena sat down across from me with her usual easy confidence. "You seem different today," she said, studying my face, less defeated. "Maybe I'm just getting used to failing," I replied, attempting humor. "Or maybe you're starting to figure out that failure is just information," she said, taking a bite of her sandwich. "The best shooters I know treat missed shots as data points, rather than personal failures." Her comment reminded me of something Dr. Mitchell had said about developing understanding through experience. Maybe the weeks of frustration and missed shots hadn't been wasted time after all. Maybe they'd been necessary preparation for whatever came next. The afternoon couldn't come fast enough. When regular classes ended, I gathered my gear and headed for Range 7 with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I had no idea what Dr. Mitchell had planned, but anything had to be better than the slow grind of conventional instruction that had gotten me nowhere. She was already there when I arrived, standing beside the firing bench with the old rifle laid out on a shooting mat.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She'd also brought what looked like camping equipment: a folding chair, a small cooler, and a pair of high-powered binoculars. "Comfortable clothes?" she asked, noting my standard academy fatigues. "Should I have brought something else?" "We're going to be here for a while," she said, gesturing toward the chair. Learning to observe environmental conditions takes time and patience. Most instructors try to compress that education into a few classroom lectures. We're going to take a different approach. She handed me the binoculars and pointed toward the distant targets. "Tell me what you see." I adjusted the focus and studied the range. Steel silhouettes at various distances, wind flags hanging limp in the still air, heat mirage beginning to rise from the concrete surfaces as the afternoon sun warmed the range. "Targets at different ranges," I said. "Maybe 400 to 800 meters. The wind flags aren't moving much, so light wind conditions." "Look closer," she said. "Look beyond the obvious things." I spent several more minutes studying the scene through the binoculars, trying to see whatever it was she wanted me to notice. Gradually, details began to emerge that I'd missed on first observation. The heat mirage wasn't uniform across the range. It was stronger in some areas than others. The vegetation moved differently in various spots, suggesting subtle air currents that weren't reflected by the wind flags. Even the light seemed to hit different surfaces with varying intensity. "The mirage is stronger on the left side of the range," I said, starting to understand what she was looking for. "And there's some kind of air movement in the trees that doesn't match what the flags are showing." "Better," she said, settling into the chair beside me. "Now we're going to sit here and watch how those conditions change over the next 2 hours. Every 15 minutes, you're going to give me a complete environmental assessment. Wind direction and speed, mirage characteristics, light conditions, anything else you notice." It sounded like the most boring training exercise imaginable, but I followed her instructions. Every 15 minutes, I provided a detailed report on what I observed through the binoculars. At first, the observations felt repetitive and pointless. The wind remained light. The mirage continued to rise from the heated surfaces. The light gradually changed angle as the sun moved across the sky. But gradually patterns began to emerge. The wind direction shifted subtly but consistently every 20 to 30 minutes. The mirage intensity changed based not just on temperature, but on the specific surface materials it was rising from. The shadows cast by terrain features created microclimates that affected local air movement in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Environmental conditions are constantly changing, Dr. Mitchell explained as I provided my fourth update. Most shooters take a quick reading when they arrive at a position and assume those conditions will remain static. But wind, temperature, light, and atmospheric pressure are dynamic variables. Understanding how they change over time is essential for making accurate shots at extended ranges. After 2 hours of observation, she finally handed me the old rifle. Now we're going to put some rounds downrange. But we're not going to use any of the conventional tools, no ballistic calculator, no wind meter, no range cards. Just what you've observed about how conditions are behaving. I settled into a shooting position behind the rifle, feeling the worn stock against my cheek. The scope was different from anything I'd used before, with thicker crosshairs and a simpler reticle that forced me to rely more on fundamental shooting skills than technological aids. Target at 500 meters, she said, pointing toward a steel silhouette that looked impossibly small through the basic optics. Based on your observations over the past 2 hours, what adjustments do you think you need to make? I thought about what I'd seen. The wind had been shifting between light, left to right, and straight on, averaging maybe 2 to 3 miles per hour. The mirage suggested the air was still warming, which might cause the bullet to impact slightly high. The distance was well beyond anything I'd attempted during regular training. Maybe 2 clicks right for wind, I said hesitantly. And I'm not sure about elevation. The mirage makes me think the bullet might go high, but 500 meters is a lot farther than I've shot before. Trust your observations, she said quietly. Make the adjustments you think are correct, and take the shot. I dialed in the corrections, trying to remember everything I'd been taught about shooting fundamentals. Natural point of aim, consistent cheek weld, controlled breathing, smooth trigger press. The rifle felt different from the precision weapons I'd been training with, more like a tool than a scientific instrument. The shot broke cleanly, and I watched through the scope as the bullet struck the steel target with a sharp clang. Not center mass, but a solid hit on a target I'd never even attempted during regular training. How did that feel? Dr. Mitchell asked. Different, I said, surprised by my own success. Less calculated, I guess. More instinctive. That's because you were relying on observation and understanding rather than technology and formulas, she explained. You developed a feel for the conditions through patient observation, then trusted that understanding when it came time to make the shot. We continued the exercise as the light faded, engaging targets at various distances using only environmental observation and basic shooting fundamentals. I didn't hit every target, but my success rate was higher than anything I'd achieved during regular training. More importantly, the process felt natural in a way that classroom instruction never had. As we packed up the equipment, Dr. Mitchell made an observation that would stick with me for weeks to come. Most instructors focus on teaching students to use tools and technology to solve shooting problems. But tools can fail, technology can malfunction, and conditions can change faster than you can run calculations. She shouldered her pack and picked up the rifle case. The approach we're developing relies on skills that can't be taken away or rendered obsolete. Observation, understanding, intuition, based on experience. Those abilities will serve you well beyond anything you'll learn in a conventional classroom. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. Regular classes during the day, where I continued to struggle with conventional instruction methods, followed by afternoon sessions at Range 7, where Dr. Mitchell introduced me to a completely different philosophy of marksmanship. We spent hours observing environmental conditions, studying how wind and weather affected bullet flight, developing an intuitive understanding of external ballistics that couldn't be reduced to mathematical formulas. My performance during regular training remained mediocre, but my confidence was slowly building. I was beginning to understand that there were multiple approaches to precision shooting, and maybe the conventional methods that worked well for other students weren't the right fit for my learning style. The other cadets noticed the change, though they couldn't identify its source. I was still missing targets during group instruction, still scoring below average on written tests, but there was something different about my demeanor. Less defeated, more focused, like someone who had found a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Hayes seems different lately, I overheard Marcus saying to Cooper during one of their lunch conversations. Still can't shoot worth a damn, but she doesn't look as beaten down as she did a few weeks ago. Maybe she's finally accepting that this isn't for her, Cooper replied. Sometimes it takes people a while to admit they're in over their heads. Their comments stung, but not in the same way they would have a month earlier. I was beginning to understand that their assessment was based on conventional measures of marksmanship skill, and conventional measures might not tell the whole story about my potential. Dr. Mitchell had hinted at this during our sessions, suggesting that different people had different aptitudes for various aspects of precision shooting. Some excelled at technical calculation, others at equipment operation, others at environmental observation and intuitive understanding. The Academy's training program was designed around one particular approach, but that didn't mean it was the only valid approach. 3 weeks into our unconventional training, Dr. Mitchell made an announcement that would change everything. Next week, we're going to attempt something that will test everything you've been learning, she said, as we finished another observation session. We're going to engage targets at distances that most instructors would consider impossible with basic equipment. I looked through the binoculars toward the far end of the range, where I could barely make out steel targets that must have been 800 meters away or more. The thought of attempting shots at such distances seemed absurd, especially with the old rifle and basic optics we'd been using. How far? I asked. Not sure I wanted to know the answer. Far enough that environmental observation becomes more important than equipment precision, she said cryptically. Far enough that conventional ballistic calculations become less reliable than intuitive understanding of how bullets behave in real-world conditions. She packed up the binoculars and shouldered her equipment. Far enough that most people would consider the shots impossible. As I walked back to the dormitory that evening, I realized that everything had been building toward this moment. The weeks of frustration with conventional training, the patient hours of environmental observation, the gradual development of an unconventional approach to marksmanship. Whatever Dr. Mitchell had planned for next week would determine whether this alternative path had been worth pursuing. But for the first time since arriving at the academy, I wasn't dreading a shooting test. Instead, I was curious to see what I might be capable of when conventional limitations no longer applied. Monday morning arrived with a kind of crisp autumn air that made distant objects seem unnaturally clear. I'd spent the weekend thinking about Dr. Mitchell's cryptic promise about impossible shots, trying to imagine what she had planned. The regular training schedule proceeded as usual, with my continued struggles providing the usual entertainment for my classmates. Watch this, Marcus announced as we set up for the morning qualification round. Hayes is going to miss the 100-meter target again. I've got $5 that says she doesn't even hit the paper. Cooper grinned and pulled out his wallet. You're on, but I'm betting she hits the paper and misses the scoring ring completely. Their wagering had become a regular feature of range time, treating my performance like a sporting event where the outcome was both predictable and amusing. I ignored them and focused on my shooting position, trying to apply some of the environmental observation techniques Dr. Mitchell had been teaching me. The morning light was creating subtle mirage patterns across the range, and I could see slight variations in how the vegetation was moving at different distances. None of this mattered for a simple 100-meter shot with iron sights, but I'd gotten into the habit of reading conditions regardless of the situation. My first shot hit the 8 ring, which was actually better than my usual performance. The second landed in the 7 ring, and the third found the 9 ring. Not spectacular, but consistent enough to avoid the worst of the ridicule. Damn, Marcus muttered, handing Cooper his $5. She's actually improving. Don't get excited, Cooper replied, pocketing the money. She's still shooting worse than most people do on their first day. Davidson recorded my scores with his usual expression of mild disappointment, but didn't make any cutting remarks. 3 shots in the black was progress, even if it fell well short of academy standards. The afternoon brought advanced ballistics instruction with Dr. Mitchell, but this time she was teaching the entire class rather than working with me individually. The topic was extreme range engagements, theoretical scenarios involving targets beyond 1,000 meters, where environmental factors became the primary challenge. At distances exceeding 800 meters, traditional ballistic calculations become less reliable, she explained, her PowerPoint showing trajectory charts that looked like abstract art. Wind deflection, Atmospheric pressure variations and temperature gradients can cause point-of-impact shifts that exceed the size of human targets. Elena raised her hand. How do military snipers make those shots in combat? Do they just accept a higher miss probability? Some rely on advanced equipment, Dr. Mitchell replied. Ballistic computers, high-end rangefinders, sophisticated weather monitoring systems. Others develop an intuitive understanding of environmental factors that allows them to make accurate shots without technological assistance. Marcus scoffed quietly. Sounds like guesswork disguised as expertise. Dr. Mitchell's eyes found his across the classroom. Would you care to elaborate on that observation, Cadet Chen? Marcus straightened, clearly enjoying the attention. I just think that modern precision shooting should be based on scientific principles rather than mystical intuition. If you can't calculate the shot, you probably shouldn't take it. An interesting perspective, Dr. Mitchell said calmly, and one that many contemporary marksmen share. However, there are documented cases of successful extreme-range engagements made under conditions where conventional calculations would have been impossible. She clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of barren mountain terrain. Afghanistan, 2009. A sniper team engaged enemy combatants at a confirmed distance of 2,400 meters, using equipment that most experts would consider inadequate for such distances. The classroom went quiet. 2,400 meters was beyond the effective range of most military sniper systems, approaching the theoretical limits of small arms accuracy. The environmental conditions included gusting winds, extreme temperature variations, and atmospheric pressure changes due to altitude, Dr. Mitchell continued. Conventional ballistic calculations would have been virtually useless, yet the engagement was successful. Cooper raised his hand. What kind of equipment were they using? Standard military rifle, basic optical sight, no ballistic computer or advanced weather monitoring equipment. The success of the engagement was attributed to the shooter's ability to read environmental conditions through observation and experience. I found myself leaning forward, fascinated despite my usual confusion with technical instruction. This was the kind of shooting Dr. Mitchell had been hinting at during our private sessions, the approach that relied on understanding rather than calculation. Of course, Marcus said, his tone suggesting polite skepticism, documented cases can be unreliable, especially when they involve classified military operations where details might be exaggerated for psychological effect. Dr. Mitchell studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. You're suggesting that the reported distances or conditions might be inaccurate? I'm suggesting that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, Marcus replied, clearly pleased with his academic-sounding response. Without verifiable data, these stories are essentially anecdotal. A strange tension settled over the classroom. Dr. Mitchell seemed to be considering something, weighing options in a way that made me think this conversation was heading somewhere unexpected. You raise an excellent point about the importance of verifiable evidence, she said finally. Perhaps a practical demonstration would be more convincing than historical anecdotes. She moved to her laptop and pulled up what looked like a range diagram showing the Academy's facilities. Range 7 extends to 1,200 meters, with steel targets placed at various intervals. Weather conditions are currently ideal for long-range work. Marcus looked uncertain now, as if he sensed he'd stepped into something more serious than classroom debate. Are you suggesting a live-fire demonstration? I'm suggesting an opportunity to observe whether extreme-range engagements are possible using basic equipment and environmental observation techniques, Dr. Mitchell replied. Unless, of course, you prefer to rely on theoretical discussions. The challenge hung in the air like cordite smoke. Marcus had positioned himself as the voice of scientific skepticism, and Dr. Mitchell was offering to test his theories against practical reality. The rest of the class watched with the fascination of people witnessing a high-stakes confrontation. I'd be very interested to observe such a demonstration, Marcus said carefully. When were you thinking of conducting it? Dr. Mitchell checked her watch. This afternoon. Range 7. 1,500 hours. Anyone interested in observing is welcome to attend. As the class filed out, excited conversations broke out immediately. Word of the demonstration spread through the academy like wildfire, and by lunchtime it seemed like every cadet and instructor knew about the challenge. The consensus was that Dr. Mitchell was either supremely confident in her abilities or making a serious mistake that would undermine her credibility. I found myself walking toward Range 7 early, wanting to observe the setup process and understand what Dr. Mitchell was planning. She was already there when I arrived, along with several other instructors who'd apparently heard about the demonstration and come to witness it themselves. The range had been configured with steel targets at distances I'd never seen attempted during regular training. Silhouettes at 600, 800, 1,000, and 1,200 meters, barely visible even through high-powered spotting scopes. The weather conditions were indeed ideal. Clear skies, light winds, excellent visibility. "Ambitious target selection," commented Major Peterson, the Academy's commandant, as he studied the range through binoculars. 1,200 meters is approaching the theoretical limits for most rifle systems. Dr. Mitchell was laying out equipment on a shooting mat, and I was surprised to see she'd brought the same worn military rifle we'd been using during our private sessions. No high-end precision weapon, no advanced optics, no ballistic computer or weather monitoring equipment. Just the basic setup that looked inadequate compared to the sophisticated gear most serious long-range shooters used. By 3 o'clock, nearly half the academy had gathered to watch the demonstration. Cadets, instructors, and support staff lined the observation area, their conversations buzzing with speculation and anticipation. Marcus stood near the front with his usual confident demeanor, but I could see tension around his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Major Peterson announced, his voice carrying across the range with military authority. "Dr. Mitchell has agreed to demonstrate extreme-range marksmanship techniques using basic equipment. For safety purposes, please remain behind the designated line until the demonstration concludes." Dr. Mitchell approached the firing position with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else. No ceremony, no dramatic preparation, just a professional settling into position behind the rifle. She spent several minutes studying the distant targets through the scope, occasionally glancing at wind flags and vegetation. "First target, 600 meters, she announced, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. The shot broke cleanly, and through my binoculars I watched the steel silhouette ring with impact. A perfect center hit that drew murmurs of appreciation from the crowd. Impressive, but not extraordinary for an instructor with her credentials. 800 meters, she called out. Another clean break, another solid hit. The murmurs grew louder. 800 meters was approaching the limits of what most academy students attempted, and she was making it look effortless. 1,000 meters. The crowd went quiet. 1,000 meters was serious long-range work, the kind of distance that separated competent marksmen from true experts. Through the spotting scope, the target looked impossibly small, more like a black dot than a human silhouette. The shot seemed to hang in the air forever before the distant clang of steel confirmed another hit. This time the crowd erupted in genuine amazement. Several instructors were shaking their heads in disbelief, and I could see Marcus looking less confident than he had an hour earlier. But Dr. Mitchell wasn't finished. She looked up from the rifle and addressed the crowd with the same calm professionalism she'd shown throughout the demonstration. 1,200 meters, she announced. Environmental factors include light crosswind from the northwest, temperature gradient due to afternoon heating, and atmospheric pressure variations typical of this elevation and season. Major Peterson stepped forward. Dr. Mitchell, I should point out that 1,200 meters exceeds the Academy's safety certifications for this range. Perhaps we should conclude the demonstration at this point. The range is certified safe to 1,500 meters, she replied, checking her notes. And all personnel are positioned well behind the safety line. Unless you have specific safety concerns? Peterson looked uncomfortable, clearly torn between institutional caution and curiosity about whether she could actually make the shot. Very well, but I want extra spotters to confirm impact location. Additional spotting scopes were set up, and several instructors positioned themselves to observe the target. The 1,200-meter silhouette was barely visible even through high-powered optics, more suggestion than substance in the afternoon haze. Dr. Mitchell returned to her shooting position and spent considerably more time studying conditions than she had for the previous shots. I watched her observe wind patterns and vegetation at various distances, note the behavior of heat mirage rising from different surfaces, and track the movement of clouds that might affect lighting conditions. The preparation took nearly 5 minutes, long enough for some spectators to grow restless, but I recognized what she was doing from our private training sessions, developing a complete environmental picture that would inform her shot placement without relying on technological aids. Finally, she settled behind the rifle and acquired the target through the scope. The range fell absolutely silent, even the wind seeming to pause in anticipation of the shot. When the rifle fired, the report echoed off the surrounding hills like thunder. Through my binoculars, I watched the target area, straining to see any indication of impact. The distance was so great that even with magnification, details were difficult to resolve. Then the unmistakable ring of steel on steel drifted back across the range, followed by spontaneous applause from the crowd. Another clean hit at a distance that challenged the capabilities of far more sophisticated equipment. But Dr. Mitchell still wasn't finished. She looked up from the rifle with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been satisfaction mixed with a hint of challenge. "I believe Cadet Chen expressed skepticism about extreme-range engagements," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet range. "Perhaps he'd be interested in observing a more challenging demonstration." Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "Ma'am, you've certainly proven your point about long-range capabilities." "Have I?" Dr. Mitchell stood up and walked to where Major Peterson was standing with the range cards. After a brief conversation, she returned to the firing position with what looked like a topographical map. "There are steel targets positioned at locations beyond the standard range boundaries," she announced to the crowd. "Targets placed for advanced training exercises that most personnel never attempt." She pointed toward the hills beyond the 1,200-meter line, where I could see nothing but terrain features and scattered vegetation. 1,500 meters, northwest bearing, elevation approximately 30 feet above our current position. I strained to see through my binoculars but couldn't identify any target in that direction. The distance was so great that individual objects blended into the landscape, creating a visual puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. "Ma'am," Major Peterson interjected, "I'm not sure those targets are visible from this position, even with spotting equipment." "They're visible," Dr. Mitchell replied calmly, "if you know how to read terrain features and understand target placement principles." She returned to her shooting position and began another extended observation period. This time, she wasn't just studying immediate environmental conditions, but analyzing the entire ballistic pathway between her position and the distant target area. Wind patterns at multiple ranges, terrain features that might affect air movement, the behavior of light and shadow across varying elevations. The preparation took nearly 10 minutes, during which the crowd grew increasingly restless. Some spectators were beginning to whisper that maybe she was stalling, that perhaps this shot was beyond even her capabilities. I found myself holding my breath as she finally settled behind the rifle. The target was so distant that I couldn't even identify what she was aiming at, much less predict whether a hit was possible. The variables involved seemed to exceed anything that could be calculated or predicted. The shot, when it came, sounded different somehow. Maybe it was my imagination, but the report seemed to carry more authority, as if the rifle understood the significance of what was being attempted. The silence that followed stretched on forever. 1,500 meters was far enough that the sound of impact, if there was one, would take several seconds to return. The crowd waited with the tension of people witnessing something that might be historic or might be embarrassing. Then, impossibly, the faint sound of steel rang across the hills. Not the sharp clang of the closer targets, but a distant metallic note that confirmed what seemed impossible. She had hit a target that most spectators couldn't even see. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Applause, cheers, and exclamations of disbelief created a cacophony that probably carried back to the main academy buildings. Several instructors were shaking their heads in amazement, and I could see cadets pulling out phones to document what they'd witnessed. But Dr. Mitchell wasn't acknowledging the celebration. She remained in position behind the rifle, still studying the distant terrain through her scope. There was something in her posture that suggested she wasn't finished, that the demonstration had been building towards something even more extraordinary. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise, "what you've observed so far represents conventional extreme-range marksmanship. Challenging shots, but within the theoretical capabilities of the equipment and techniques involved." The crowd quieted, sensing that something significant was about to happen. However, there are engagements that exceed conventional understanding of what's possible with small arms fire. Shots that require not just technical skill, but an intuitive understanding of environmental factors that can't be measured or calculated. She pointed toward a different section of the hills, even more distant than the previous target. 2,000 meters, northeast bearing, target obscured by terrain features and atmospheric conditions. Major Peterson stepped forward, his expression serious. Dr. Mitchell, I must advise that 2,000 meters is well beyond our safety certification and probably beyond the effective range of that rifle system. The range boundaries extend to 2,500 meters, she replied, checking her map again. And the effective range of a rifle system depends largely on the skill of the person operating it. She looked directly at Marcus, who had gone pale during the demonstration. Cadet Chen, you mentioned that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Would a successful engagement at 2,000 meters qualify as extraordinary evidence? Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. The challenge was direct and unmistakable, and backing down would undermine every skeptical comment he'd made during the afternoon. He started, then stopped. Ma'am, I think you've already demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything taught in our coursework. That wasn't my question, Dr. Mitchell said calmly. I asked whether a successful 2,000-meter engagement would constitute extraordinary evidence for the techniques I've been describing. The crowd was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something that went beyond a simple marksmanship demonstration. This had become a fundamental challenge to conventional understanding of what was possible with basic equipment and unconventional techniques. Yes, ma'am, Marcus finally replied, his voice barely audible. A confirmed hit at 2,000 meters would definitely qualify as extraordinary evidence. Dr. Mitchell nodded and returned to her shooting position. This time her preparation was even more extensive, involving not just environmental observation, but what looked like complex mental calculations based on terrain analysis and atmospheric modeling. She moved between different positions along the firing line, studying the target area from multiple angles and taking notes in a small field book. I realized I was watching something unprecedented. The distance she was attempting exceeded the documented capabilities of most military sniper systems, and she was using equipment that looked like surplus from another era. If she could make this shot, it would challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between technology and marksmanship skill. The preparation took nearly 20 minutes, during which the crowd remained unusually quiet. Some spectators had begun using spotting scopes and binoculars to search for the target she'd identified, but the distance and terrain made visual confirmation nearly impossible. When she finally settled behind the rifle, her entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the casual confidence she'd shown for the earlier shots, replaced by an intensity that suggested she was operating at the absolute limits of her capabilities. Every movement was precise and deliberate, as if she understood that margin for error had been eliminated entirely. The shot, when it finally came, was preceded by a stillness that seemed to affect the entire range. No wind, no movement, no sound except the distant hum of insects and the barely audible whisper of Dr. Mitchell's controlled breathing. The rifle's report was sharper than before, more authoritative, carrying across the hills with a finality that suggested something significant had just occurred. But the distance was so great that confirming the impact would require more than just listening for the sound of steel. Dr. Mitchell remained in position, studying the target area through her scope while the crowd waited in absolute silence. Seconds stretched into minutes as she searched for some indication of whether the shot had found its mark. Then she stood up, her expression unreadable, and addressed Major Peterson. Sir, I recommend dispatching a vehicle to confirm impact at the 2,000-meter target location. Grid coordinates are marked on this map. Peterson studied the map she handed him, his expression grave. Dr. Mitchell, are you claiming a successful engagement at that distance? I'm requesting verification of impact, she replied carefully. The shot felt correct, but visual confirmation at that range is difficult, even with optical aids. The major turned to one of the other instructors. Captain Williams, take a vehicle and check the target area. Full documentation if there's evidence of impact. As Williams departed with a small team, an uncomfortable tension settled over the range. Everyone understood that they might have just witnessed something historic, but confirmation would require more than just the shooter's assessment. Dr. Mitchell began packing her equipment with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything else, showing no sign of the drama that had just unfolded. But I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she secured the rifle in its case, the first indication I'd seen that even she was affected by the magnitude of what she'd attempted. The wait for confirmation felt endless. Conversations broke out in small groups, with cadets and instructors debating what they'd witnessed and speculating about the implications. Marcus stood alone, looking like someone who just watched his understanding of reality get systematically dismantled. 20 minutes later, Captain Williams's voice crackled over the radio with a single word that changed everything. Confirmed. The crowd erupted again, but this time the celebration was different. Not just appreciation for impressive marksmanship, but genuine awe at witnessing something that challenged conventional understanding of what was possible. Dr. Mitchell finally acknowledged the reaction, but her response was characteristically understated. Environmental observation and intuitive understanding of ballistic principles can enable engagements that exceed the capabilities of technological solutions, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the range. The equipment is less important than the knowledge and experience of the person using it. Major Peterson approached her as the crowd began to disperse, his expression mixing respect with professional curiosity. Dr. Mitchell, I think we need to discuss incorporating some of these techniques into our advanced curriculum. That might be challenging, she replied, shouldering her equipment bag. These methods require extensive field experience and can't easily be compressed into classroom instruction. As they walked toward the parking area, I found myself following at a distance, still processing what I'd witnessed. The demonstration had been more than just impressive shooting. It had been a masterclass in unconventional approaches to complex problems. But the most significant moment came as the crowd was dispersing, and I was gathering my own equipment. Dr. Mitchell approached me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been satisfaction mixed with anticipation. "What did you observe during the demonstration?" she asked quietly. I thought about everything I'd witnessed, trying to identify the most important elements. "You weren't just shooting at targets," I said slowly. "You were demonstrating that conventional limitations don't always apply when you understand the underlying principles involved." She nodded approvingly. "And what does that suggest about your own training progress?" The implications hit me like a physical force. If Dr. Mitchell could exceed conventional expectations using unconventional methods, then maybe my struggles with standard instruction didn't indicate a fundamental lack of ability. Maybe they indicated that I needed a different approach entirely. "It suggests," I said carefully, "that maybe I've been measuring myself against the wrong standards." "Tomorrow," she said, turning to leave, "we're going to find out what you're really capable of." As I walked back toward the dormitory, my mind was spinning with possibilities and questions. The demonstration had changed everything, not just about my understanding of marksmanship, but about my understanding of my own potential. If Dr. Mitchell was right, if conventional limitations could be exceeded through understanding and experience rather than technology and calculation, then maybe everything I thought I knew about my abilities was wrong. The other cadets were buzzing with excitement about what they'd witnessed, but their conversations felt distant and irrelevant. I was thinking about tomorrow, about the promise Dr. Mitchell had made, about the possibility that I might be capable of something I'd never imagined. For the first time since arriving at the academy, I wasn't dreading my next shooting session. Instead, I was eager to discover what lay beyond the conventional boundaries I'd been struggling against for weeks. The evening study session was subdued, with most cadets still processing the implications of Dr. Mitchell's demonstration. Marcus sat alone in the corner, staring at ballistics charts that probably seemed less authoritative than they had that morning. Elena approached me as I was reviewing my notes from the afternoon. "That was incredible," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I've never seen shooting like that, especially with basic equipment." "It changes how you think about what's possible," I agreed, closing my notebook. "Dr. Mitchell was working with you before today, wasn't she?" Elena's question was direct, but not accusatory. "I noticed you spending time at Range 7 after regular classes." I nodded, unsure how much I should reveal about our unconventional training sessions. "Whatever she's been teaching you," Elena continued, "it's working. You seem different, more confident, more focused, like you've found something you didn't know you were looking for." Her observation was more accurate than she probably realized. The weeks of alternative instruction had given me something I'd never had before, the sense that there might be a path forward that didn't require me to be someone I wasn't. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting," I said, gathering my materials. "Why? What's happening tomorrow?" I looked toward the window, where Range 7 was barely visible in the gathering darkness. I think I'm about to find out what I'm really capable of. That night, sleep came slowly. My mind kept replaying the demonstration, analyzing each shot and trying to understand the principles behind Dr. Mitchell's success. But more than that, I was thinking about her final comment, about discovering my own capabilities. For weeks, I'd been struggling to meet other people's expectations, trying to force myself into a mold that didn't fit. But what if the problem wasn't my lack of ability? What if the problem was that I'd been trying to succeed using methods that weren't suited to my learning style or natural inclinations? The thought was both exciting and terrifying. If Dr. Mitchell was right, if I had been measuring myself against inappropriate standards, then tomorrow might reveal abilities I didn't know I possessed. But it might also confirm that even unconventional approaches couldn't overcome fundamental limitations. Either way, I was about to find out who I really was as a marksman, and that knowledge would change everything about my future at the academy and beyond. Dawn broke with the kind of crystalline clarity that made every detail of the landscape sharp and distinct. I had barely slept, my mind cycling through everything Dr. Mitchell had demonstrated the previous afternoon and what it might mean for my own capabilities. The academy felt different somehow, as if the rules governing what was possible had fundamentally changed. I arrived at Range 7 early, finding Dr. Mitchell already there with equipment I'd never seen before. Alongside her familiar worn rifle were several other weapons, each representing a different era and philosophy of precision shooting. An ancient bolt-action rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum, a modern precision system with advanced optics, and something that appeared to be completely custom-built. Today we're going to explore the relationship between equipment and capability, she said without preamble, gesturing toward the array of rifles. Most shooters assume that better equipment automatically translates to better performance. We're going to test that assumption. She picked up the museum piece, its wooden stock scarred by decades of use. This rifle was manufactured in 1943. Iron sights, basic bolt action. Ammunition that was considered adequate for its time but primitive by current standards. In the right hands, it's been used to make shots that would challenge modern sniper systems. Next came the contemporary precision rifle, bristling with technological sophistication, computerized ballistic calculations, environmental sensors, range-finding capability, optics that can resolve targets at distances measured in miles. Everything current doctrine suggests is necessary for extreme range work. Finally, she lifted the custom weapon, and I could see immediately that it was something special. Every component had been individually selected and precisely fitted, creating a system that looked more like a work of art than a military tool. This represents the ultimate expression of precision engineering applied to small arms design. Custom barrel, hand-loaded ammunition, optics that cost more than most people's cars, theoretically capable of accuracy that approaches the physical limits of ballistic performance. I studied the three rifles, trying to understand what point she was making. Which one would be best for extreme range work? That depends, she said, on what you mean by extreme range, and more importantly, on the person behind the rifle. She gestured toward the distant hills where yesterday's demonstration had taken place. Today we're going to test each system at progressively longer distances, using identical environmental conditions and shooting positions. She handed me a range card showing target locations that made my stomach clench with anxiety. Distances starting at 800 meters and extending out to positions I couldn't even locate with binoculars. The final target was marked at a distance that seemed impossible. 3,000 meters. Dr. Mitchell, I said carefully, some of these ranges are beyond anything we've attempted during training. Some of these ranges are beyond anything most people attempt during their entire careers. She replied calmly, but that doesn't mean they're impossible, just that they require different approaches and different levels of understanding. She began the demonstration with the modern precision system, spending considerable time inputting environmental data into its ballistic computer and adjusting the sophisticated optics. The process was methodical and scientific, exactly the kind of approach that appealed to cadets like Marcus, who preferred technological solutions to complex problems. The first shot, at 800 meters, was perfect. The computer-assisted system had calculated every variable and compensated for environmental factors with mechanical precision. The target rang with the solid impact of a centered hit, and I could understand why most serious shooters relied on advanced equipment for long-range work. 1,000 meters brought similar results. The ballistic computer crunched environmental data and provided precise adjustments that translated into another clean hit. Technology was performing exactly as advertised, removing human error from the equation and delivering predictable accuracy. But at 1,200 meters, subtle problems began to emerge. The environmental conditions were changing faster than the computer could track, and the calculated solutions were beginning to diverge from actual requirements. The shot still hit the target, but off-center, suggesting that technological perfection had limitations when conditions became truly dynamic. Environmental factors are constantly evolving, Dr. Mitchell explained as she transitioned to the custom rifle. Ballistic computers calculate solutions based on measured conditions, but those measurements represent snapshots of continuously changing variables. At extreme ranges, small errors in environmental assessment translate to significant point-of-impact shifts. The custom system performed admirably at extended ranges, its precision engineering translating into consistent accuracy even as distances stretched beyond normal engagement parameters. But I could see that Dr. Mitchell was working harder to achieve hits, spending more time on environmental assessment and making intuitive adjustments that went beyond what her equipment could calculate. At 1,500 meters, the custom rifle delivered another solid hit, but the process had become significantly more complex. Equipment alone was no longer sufficient. Success required the shooter to interpret environmental conditions in ways that exceeded technological capability. "Now we try something different," Dr. Mitchell said, setting aside the sophisticated systems and picking up the 1943 rifle with its iron sights and basic optics. This represents the approach used by some of the most effective marksmen in history. No computers, no environmental sensors, no technological assistance beyond basic magnification. I watched in fascination as she began the same observation process I'd learned during our private sessions, studying wind patterns and atmospheric conditions with patient intensity. But now I understood what I was seeing. She was developing an environmental picture that was more complete and dynamic than anything a computer could calculate. The first shot with the vintage rifle, at 800 meters, was as accurate as anything achieved with the modern systems. Not because the equipment was superior, but because the shooter's understanding of environmental factors was more complete than what technology could provide. As distances increased, the advantage of intuitive environmental reading became even more pronounced. At 1,200 meters, where the computerized system had begun to struggle with changing conditions, the iron-sighted rifle delivered centered hits that seemed to defy conventional ballistics. "This is what you've been learning during our sessions," Dr. Mitchell explained as she prepared for even longer shots. The ability to read environmental conditions at a level that exceeds technological analysis. Equipment can measure wind speed, but it can't interpret how terrain features create microclimates that affect bullet flight across varying distances. At 1,500 meters, the vintage rifle continued to perform with accuracy that challenged my understanding of what was possible. Dr. Mitchell was making shots that would be considered exceptional with modern equipment, using a system that most contemporary shooters would consider obsolete. But the real test came when she pointed toward targets that were barely visible, even through high-powered spotting scopes. Distances that approached the theoretical limits of small arms effectiveness, where environmental factors became more important than equipment specifications. 2,000 meters, she announced, settling behind the iron-sighted rifle. Environmental conditions include complex wind patterns created by terrain features, atmospheric pressure variations due to elevation changes, and temperature gradients that affect air density across the bullet's flight path. The preparation took nearly 15 minutes, during which she studied not just immediate conditions, but the entire ballistic pathway between her position and the distant target. I realized I was watching someone who understood bullet flight at a level that transcended conventional ballistics, interpreting environmental factors through experience rather than calculation. When the shot finally came, it seemed to hang in the air forever, before the distant ring of steel confirmed another impossible hit. But Dr. Mitchell wasn't finished with her demonstration of unconventional capabilities. 2,500 meters, she said, consulting her range card. Beyond the effective range of most military sniper systems, approaching the limits of what's possible with standard small arms ammunition. This time, the preparation was even more extensive, involving not just environmental observation, but what looked like complex mental modeling of ballistic trajectories across varying atmospheric conditions. She moved between different positions along the firing line, studying the target area from multiple angles and taking detailed notes about wind patterns and terrain effects. The shot, when it came, was preceded by a stillness that seemed to affect the entire range. Everything depended on perfect environmental reading and flawless execution, with no margin for error at such extreme distance. The rifle's report echoed across the hills, and we waited in silence for confirmation of impact. At 2,500 meters, even the sound of steel would take several seconds to return, if there was any sound to return at all. Then, impossibly, the faint ring of metal on metal drifted back across the distance, confirming what seemed to challenge the laws of physics. She had hit a target at a range where most rifles wouldn't even be effective, using equipment that predated modern ballistic science. "Your turn," Dr. Mitchell said, stepping away from the firing position. The words hit me like a physical blow. "Ma'am, I've never attempted anything close to these distances." "You've been preparing for this moment since our first session at Range 7, she replied calmly. "Every hour spent observing environmental conditions, every shot taken using intuitive assessment rather than calculated solutions. This is what it's been building toward." She gestured toward the rifle she'd been using, its iron sights and basic optics suddenly looking both primitive and intimidating. "Conventional wisdom says these shots are impossible with this equipment. Conventional wisdom also says you lack the aptitude for precision marksmanship. We're going to test both assumptions." My hands shook as I settled behind the rifle, its unfamiliar weight and balance requiring mental adjustments I wasn't sure I could make. The scope was different from anything I'd used before, with thick crosshairs and basic magnification that forced me to rely on fundamental shooting skills rather than technological assistance. "Start with the 1,200-meter target," Dr. Mitchell instructed. "Use everything you've learned about environmental observation. Trust your understanding of how conditions affect bullet flight." I spent several minutes studying the target area through the scope, trying to apply the techniques she'd taught me during our private sessions. Wind patterns in vegetation at various distances, the behavior of heat mirage rising from different surfaces, the way atmospheric conditions affected the clarity of distant objects. The target looked impossibly small through the basic optics, more suggestion than substance in the afternoon haze. But as I continued to observe, patterns began to emerge that I'd learned to recognize during weeks of patient instruction. The wind was shifting between light left to right and nearly calm, averaging perhaps 2 miles per hour. Temperature gradients created by uneven heating of terrain features were generating subtle air currents that wouldn't show up on conventional wind flags. The atmospheric pressure felt stable, but humidity was increasing as afternoon shadows lengthened. I made intuitive adjustments based on these observations, dialing corrections into the scope that felt right, even though I couldn't calculate their precise values. The rifle settled naturally into my shoulder, its worn stock fitting against my cheek with surprising comfort. The shot broke cleanly, and I watched through the scope as the bullet struck the steel target with a solid clang. Not centered, but a clean hit at a distance I'd never attempted before. 1,500 meters, Dr. Mitchell said without pause. This target was barely visible through the scope, requiring me to use terrain features and memory to identify its location. The environmental assessment became more complex at this distance, with multiple wind zones and atmospheric variations affecting different portions of the bullet's flight path. I found myself entering a mental state I'd never experienced before, where environmental observation and ballistic understanding merged into intuitive knowledge that bypassed conscious calculation. The corrections I made to the scope felt natural rather than analytical, based on pattern recognition rather than mathematical computation. The second shot was more difficult, requiring longer preparation and more complex environmental assessment. But when I finally pressed the trigger, the distant ring of steel confirmed another hit at a range I'd thought impossible for someone with my limited experience. 2,000 meters, Dr. Mitchell announced, and I felt my confidence waver. 2,000 meters was serious extreme range work, the kind of shooting that challenged experienced snipers with advanced equipment. Attempting it with iron sights and basic optics seemed beyond ambitious. It seemed reckless. But as I studied the distant target area, something remarkable happened. The environmental patterns I'd been learning to recognize became clearer rather than more complex. Wind behavior across varying terrain, atmospheric effects on bullet flight, the way different surfaces generated thermal currents, all of it began to make intuitive sense in a way that transcended conscious analysis. The preparation took nearly 20 minutes, during which I developed what felt like a complete three-dimensional picture of the ballistic environment between my position and the target. Not calculated understanding, but intuitive comprehension based on pattern recognition and environmental observation. When I finally settled behind the rifle, everything felt different. The basic equipment no longer seemed primitive. It felt like a precision instrument perfectly suited to the task. The environmental conditions weren't obstacles to overcome, but information to be interpreted and used. The shot felt perfect from the moment it left the barrel, tracking through the air with a ballistic trajectory that seemed to conform exactly to environmental conditions. The wait for impact confirmation stretched endlessly, but I knew with strange certainty that the bullet had found its mark. The distant clang of steel confirmed what I'd somehow known. Another clean hit at a distance that should have been impossible for someone of my experience level using such basic equipment. But Dr. Mitchell wasn't finished with my education and unconventional capabilities. "There's one more target," she said, consulting her range card. 3,000 meters, northeast bearing, positioned on the ridgeline, beyond the normal range boundaries. 3,000 meters. The distance was so extreme that I couldn't even locate the target through the scope, much less imagine hitting it. This was approaching the maximum effective range of dedicated sniper systems, far beyond what should be possible with iron sights and intuitive shooting techniques. "Dr. Mitchell," I said carefully, "I'm not sure I can even see a target at that distance." "Visibility is less important than understanding," she replied. "At extreme ranges, you're not shooting at what you can see clearly. You're shooting at what you understand to be there based on environmental assessment and ballistic knowledge." She guided me through the process of locating the target using terrain features and compass bearings, teaching me to identify target areas through indirect observation rather than direct visual contact. It was like learning a new language of landscape interpretation that went far beyond conventional marksmanship training. The environmental assessment for a 3,000-meter shot was unlike anything I'd attempted before. Wind patterns across multiple terrain zones, atmospheric pressure variations due to elevation changes, temperature gradients that affected air density throughout the bullet's extended flight path. The complexity was overwhelming using conventional analysis, but somehow manageable through intuitive pattern recognition. I spent nearly 30 minutes developing my environmental picture, studying conditions with the patient intensity Dr. Mitchell had taught me during our early sessions. Gradually, the complexity resolved into patterns I could understand and use, environmental factors becoming tools rather than obstacles. When I finally settled behind the rifle, I experienced something that can only be described as perfect clarity. Environmental conditions, ballistic trajectory, and target location merged into a single unified understanding that bypassed conscious thought entirely. The adjustments I made to the scope came from intuitive knowledge, rather than calculated precision. The shot felt different from anything I'd ever experienced. Not just technically correct, but perfectly matched to environmental conditions in a way that seemed to transcend normal ballistic limitations. The bullet's trajectory felt predetermined, as if environmental factors were guiding rather than hindering its flight. The wait for confirmation was eternal. At 3,000 meters, the sound of impact would take several seconds to return, assuming there was any impact to confirm. But I sat behind the rifle with strange confidence, knowing that something extraordinary had just occurred. When the distant ring of steel finally reached us, it carried across the hills with a clarity that confirmed not just impact, but centered impact. I had hit a target at a distance that challenged the theoretical limits of small arms effectiveness, using equipment that most experts would consider inadequate for such extreme range work. Dr. Mitchell's reaction was unlike anything I'd seen from her before. Not surprise, but something that looked like satisfaction mixed with recognition, as if she'd been waiting for this moment since our first meeting. "Outstanding," she said quietly. That was precision shooting at the highest level. As I set down the rifle, my hands were shaking with adrenaline and disbelief. I'd just accomplished something that seemed to defy conventional understanding of marksmanship capabilities, using techniques that couldn't be found in any military manual or civilian training program. "How is this possible?" I asked, still processing what had just occurred. 3 weeks ago, I couldn't hit targets at 100 meters. 3 weeks ago, you were trying to force yourself into conventional molds that didn't fit your natural learning style, Dr. Mitchell replied. What you've just demonstrated is the result of developing your own approach to precision shooting, based on environmental understanding rather than technological dependence. She began packing her equipment with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything else. Most marksmen rely on equipment and calculations to solve shooting problems. You've learned to read environmental conditions at a level that makes equipment secondary and calculations unnecessary. As we walked back toward the parking area, I found myself struggling to understand the implications of what had just happened. Does this mean I've been approaching everything wrong since arriving at the academy? It means you've been measuring yourself against standards that don't apply to your particular strengths, she said. Conventional marksmanship training works well for most people, but some individuals have capabilities that exceed conventional limitations when properly developed. We loaded the equipment into her vehicle, and I expected her to drive me back to the academy. Instead, she turned toward a different road that led away from the training facilities entirely. "Where are we going?" I asked. "To meet some people who will be very interested in what you've just accomplished," she replied cryptically. People who understand that exceptional capabilities require exceptional opportunities. The drive took us into hills I'd never explored, along roads that didn't appear on any academy maps I'd seen. After nearly an hour, we arrived at what looked like a private training facility, complete with ranges that extended farther than anything at the academy and equipment that suggested serious governmental funding. Dr. Mitchell led me to a building that looked more like a command center than a training facility, with communications equipment and computer systems that indicated connections to military networks. Inside, several people in civilian clothes were waiting, their bearing and attention to detail suggesting military backgrounds despite their informal appearance. "Gentlemen," Dr. Mitchell announced, "I'd like you to meet the marksman I've been telling you about." A tall man with graying hair stepped forward, studying me with the kind of professional assessment I'd learned to recognize from military personnel. "Dr. Mitchell has shared some remarkable reports about your capabilities. We understand you've just completed some exceptional long-range work." I looked at Dr. Mitchell, suddenly understanding that this meeting had been planned well in advance. "Who are these people?" "Representatives from organizations that specialize in unconventional approaches to complex problems," she replied carefully. "People who understand that exceptional individual capabilities can be more valuable than technological solutions." The graying man gestured toward a conference table where several folders marked with classification stamps were waiting. "We've been following your progress through Dr. Mitchell's reports. What interests us isn't just your shooting ability, but your approach to environmental analysis and problem-solving under pressure." As we sat down, he opened one of the folders to reveal photographs of terrain that looked nothing like the Academy's training ranges. Mountain landscapes, urban environments, desert conditions that suggested operational scenarios rather than training exercises. Conventional military snipers are trained to operate within established parameters using standardized equipment and procedures, he explained. But there are situations where conventional approaches are inadequate, where success requires individuals who can exceed normal limitations through unconventional methods. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, her expression serious. "What we're offering is an opportunity to develop your capabilities beyond anything possible through standard military channels. Training that focuses on your particular strengths rather than forcing you to conform to conventional standards." The photographs in the folder showed shooting positions and target areas that made the Academy's ranges look elementary. Distances that approached the maximum theoretical range of small arms fire. Environmental conditions that would challenge the most sophisticated equipment. Scenarios that required not just technical skill but creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. "This is real-world application," the graying man continued. "Situations where lives depend on capabilities that exceed conventional understanding of what's possible. Are you interested in that level of responsibility?" I studied the materials spread across the table, trying to understand the full implications of what was being offered. This wasn't just advanced training. It was recruitment into something that operated beyond normal military channels. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I said carefully. "We're asking you to become who you really are," Dr. Mitchell replied. "Someone whose capabilities transcend conventional limitations. Someone who can accomplish missions that others would consider impossible." The graying man closed the folder and looked directly at me. "The choice is yours. You can return to the Academy, complete conventional training, and become a competent military marksman within established parameters. Or you can join us and discover what you're truly capable of when limitations are removed." As I considered the offer, I realized that everything had been leading to this moment. The weeks of struggle with conventional training, the patient development of environmental observation skills, the gradual discovery of capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. Dr. Mitchell hadn't just been teaching me alternative shooting techniques. She'd been preparing me for opportunities that existed beyond normal military structures. "If I accept," I asked, "what happens to my academic obligations?" "Officially, you'll be transferred to advanced individual training that requires security clearances beyond normal academy access. Dr. Mitchell explained. Your family will be informed that you've been selected for specialized programs that can't be discussed for security reasons. The graying man added, What we're offering represents opportunities that few people ever encounter. The chance to develop exceptional capabilities and apply them to situations where conventional solutions are inadequate. But it also represents commitments that extend far beyond normal military service. I thought about everything that had brought me to this point. The humiliation of failing at conventional training, the gradual discovery of alternative approaches, the sudden revelation of capabilities I'd never imagined possessing. Most importantly, I thought about the feeling of perfect clarity I'd experienced during those impossible shots, the sense of operating at levels that transcended normal human limitations. When would this training begin? I asked. Immediately, Dr. Mitchell replied. Tonight, if you're ready to leave the academy permanently. The finality of the decision struck me forcefully. This wasn't just advanced training. It was a complete departure from everything I'd planned for my future. But as I considered the alternatives, I realized that returning to conventional training would mean accepting limitations that I now knew didn't apply to me. I accept, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. The graying man smiled for the first time since I'd met him. Outstanding. Dr. Mitchell will handle the administrative details while we begin preparing your training curriculum. As we left the conference room, Dr. Mitchell walked beside me with an expression of satisfaction that suggested long-term planning finally coming to fruition. You've just made a decision that will change your life in ways you can't imagine. Will I see you during this training? I asked. You'll see me whenever you need guidance that goes beyond conventional instruction, she replied. But most of your education from this point forward will come from experience rather than classroom learning. That evening, as I packed my belongings and prepared to leave the academy permanently, I reflected on everything that had changed since my arrival. I'd come here as the senator's daughter, trying to prove herself through conventional military training, failing consistently, and becoming the target of ridicule from classmates who excelled within established parameters. But I was leaving as something entirely different, someone who had discovered capabilities that transcended normal limitations, someone whose approach to complex problems couldn't be contained within conventional training structures. The other cadets were in the dining hall when I carried my bags to the waiting vehicle, and I could see their confusion about my sudden departure. Marcus looked particularly puzzled, probably wondering how someone who'd struggled with basic marksmanship had suddenly been selected for advanced individual training. Elena intercepted me near the exit, her expression mixing curiosity with genuine concern. Where are you going? The rumor is that you've been selected for some kind of classified program. Something like that, I replied, not wanting to lie but unable to explain the full truth. Will you keep in touch? She asked. Probably not, I admitted. I think where I'm going operates under different rules than normal military communication. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded with understanding. Whatever you're doing, I think you found where you belong. You seem different than when you arrived. More focused, I guess. As the vehicle carried me away from the academy, I watched the familiar buildings disappear behind us and felt no regret about leaving. The conventional training environment had never been the right fit for my learning style or natural capabilities. What lay ahead remained uncertain, but it offered opportunities to develop abilities that I was only beginning to understand. Dr. Mitchell sat beside me as we drove toward whatever came next, her expression reflecting satisfaction with long-term planning that had finally achieved its objectives. Any questions about what you're getting yourself into? Hundreds, I replied. But I suspect they'll be answered through experience rather than explanation. You're learning to think beyond conventional parameters, she said approvingly. That's exactly the mindset required for what comes next. As we drove through the night toward training facilities that didn't appear on any official maps, I understood that everything was about to change in ways I couldn't predict or prepare for. But for the first time since leaving home, I felt like I was moving toward something that matched my actual capabilities, rather than trying to force myself into roles that would never fit properly. The academy had taught me what I couldn't do within conventional limitations. What came next would teach me what I could accomplish when those limitations were removed entirely. 3 years later, I stood on a mountainside in a country that officially didn't exist on any current conflict maps. studying a target through binoculars that revealed details most people would miss entirely. The environmental conditions were challenging: shifting winds, atmospheric pressure variations due to extreme altitude, temperature gradients that affected air density across multiple climate zones. The target was located at a distance that exceeded the maximum effective range of most sniper systems, 5,000 meters across terrain that made environmental assessment as important as marksmanship skill. Conventional wisdom said the shot was impossible using any equipment, much less the basic rifle system I carried. But conventional wisdom had proven inadequate for the situations I now faced regularly. 3 years of unconventional training had developed capabilities that transcended normal human limitations, allowing me to accomplish missions that others would consider beyond the realm of possibility. I removed the scope from my rifle, relying instead on iron sights and environmental observation techniques that couldn't be detected or countered by enemy technology. At 5,000 meters, the target was invisible to direct visual observation, requiring me to use terrain features and atmospheric conditions to guide bullet placement through intuitive understanding rather than technological assistance. The environmental assessment took nearly an hour, during which I developed a complete three-dimensional picture of atmospheric conditions throughout the extended ballistic pathway. Wind patterns across multiple elevation zones, pressure variations due to terrain features, thermal currents generated by uneven surface heating, all of it processed through pattern recognition rather than mathematical calculation. When I finally settled behind the rifle, everything felt perfectly clear. Environmental conditions, ballistic trajectory, and target location merged into unified understanding that bypassed conscious thought entirely. The shot wasn't calculated. It was inevitable, predetermined by environmental factors that I'd learned to read like a familiar language. The bullet's flight time at 5,000 meters seemed endless, tracking through atmospheric conditions that most marksmen would consider impossible to predict or compensate for. But I waited with calm certainty, knowing that environmental understanding had guided the shot more precisely than any technological solution could achieve. The confirmation came not as sound. 5,000 meters was too far for audio verification, but as visual observation through distant optical surveillance that watched the target area collapse exactly as mission parameters required. Another impossible shot completed successfully, using capabilities that exceeded conventional understanding of human limitations. Another mission accomplished through methods that couldn't be taught in classrooms or learned from manuals. As I packed my equipment and prepared to leave the mountainside, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from academic failure to operational success at the highest levels. The Academy had been right about one thing. Conventional marksmanship training was essential for most military applications. But they'd been wrong about my potential within unconventional parameters. The capabilities Dr. Mitchell had helped me discover operated beyond normal human limitations, allowing me to accomplish missions that required not just technical skill, but intuitive understanding of environmental factors that exceeded technological analysis. The radio in my pack crackled with extraction coordinates, and I began moving toward the pickup point with the same quiet efficiency that characterized everything about my current life. No recognition, no official records, no acknowledgement of capabilities that operated beyond conventional military structures. But as I walked through terrain that would challenge most experienced operators, I felt the satisfaction that came from discovering who I really was beneath artificial limitations. The senator's daughter who'd failed at basic marksmanship training had evolved into someone whose capabilities transcended conventional understanding of what humans could accomplish. Dr. Mitchell had been right about exceptional individuals requiring exceptional opportunities. The path that led away from conventional training had revealed abilities that could never have developed within established parameters, capabilities that made impossible missions routine rather than extraordinary. Years later, when military historians studied conflicts that officially never occurred, they would note the presence of precision engagements at distances that challenged conventional ballistics. Shots made under conditions that should have prevented accurate fire, using equipment that seemed inadequate for the distances involved. But the individuals responsible for those engagements would remain unacknowledged, their capabilities unknown to anyone outside the organizations that understood the value of exceeding conventional limitations. Success achieved through methods that couldn't be replicated or taught to those who preferred technological solutions to complex problems. I had become exactly what Dr. Mitchell had seen potential for during those early sessions at Range 7, someone whose understanding of environmental factors exceeded technological capability. Someone who could accomplish what others considered impossible through patience, observation, and intuitive understanding of ballistic principles that transcended conventional training. The academy had taught me what I couldn't do within established parameters. Everything that followed had taught me what I could accomplish when those parameters were removed entirely. And in that discovery, I'd found not just exceptional capability, but the purpose that came from applying those capabilities to situations where conventional solutions were inadequate. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.